so far is this very Kantian interpretation of the ring cycle. And in these last chapters, we have, and it's kind of disorganized. You can see that Roger was sort of getting a bit toward the end. And but you can sort of filter out what points he wanted to make. And the general topics would be love, power, law. And then he also talks intriguingly to me about Siegfried and other problems. I'd like to start with that because we've dealt with Siegfried in two operas now. And this idea that Siegfried and other problems, well, that suggests Siegfried is a problem. Do you think Siegfried's a problem? The whole thing is supposed to be about him, after all. What's so problematic about Siegfried, at least from Roger's point of view? Well, it's quite obvious if you get into this reading and Roger's discussion of it. Siegfried does not fit this Kantian interpretation. So he's sort of relegated to this strange chapter of the book, which is actually a rather short chapter, where Siegfried's discussed as a problem of interpretations. And Roger points out a lot of the usual critiques, perhaps critiques you had watching Siegfried and then Götterdämmerung. Siegfried lacks self-awareness. He's extraordinarily self-centered. He's hubristic in the sense of Greek tragedy, which I think is done by Wagner on purpose. And it's also said that he lacks humility, which is a terrible character flaw, especially for an English philosopher. And that without those characteristics, he's not really moving in this direction of self-actualization. If you buy the rest of the Kantian interpretation that Roger has given us, the sort of Kant-Hegel view of things, it really should be that Siegfried progresses toward a greater understanding of self, much in the way that Wotan does, and arguably in the way Brünnhilde does through the cycle. But Siegfried really doesn't until his last moments of life, until he's finally treacherously killed. He has this mortal wound after being stabbed in the back, itself a tremendous metaphor that would have horrific significance in the 20th century. And only then do we have this kind of arc of understanding, a kind of rebirth of his innocence. Roger reminds us that in classical antiquity, in classical tragedy, heroes have to die to be reborn. And Siegfried very much has to die to be reborn. When he's stabbed in that wonderful scene in the third act, and he has his reminiscence of Brünnhilde, it starts with that motif of her awakening, just as he is now awakening. It proceeds through this very, very resolute music about recounting his life. And then finally, after he dies, you get the magic, this fire march, not the fire march, but this magic Trauermarsch, this funeral music, which when played effectively can make you very angry if you're listening to it in some of the classic performances, but really tells Siegfried's entire life story, starting with his parentage and the music and motifs associated with Siegmund and Sieglinde, and then with other people who are important to the story, and of course with Siegfried's own actions, and finally his betrayal and demise. Then you get the final scene. But what I think happened with Roger's interpretation is largely the same thing that happened with Shaw. Shaw had an allegorical socialist interpretation that gets all the way to Götterdämmerung and then stops. And the problem with that is Götterdämmerung doesn't fit his narrative theory quite very well. So he says, well, the fault really is Wagner's for not living up to my expectations 30 years before I'm writing this, and he didn't complete what I would believe the allegory should be. And there are important philosophical reasons for that we can talk about in relation to this and the other topics we mentioned. I'll start by saying that once again that looking at Wagner and philosophy is very hard, especially when you're dealing with the Ring of the Nibelung. Why? Because it's a moving target. What influences Wagner over the course of his life, this 28-year period during which he's working on one composite work of art, is very hard to define. It's very difficult to identify which philosopher is influencing him at which moment, and we understand that this changes over time. And looking back over the Love and Power chapter, the previous chapter before Siegfried, you find that the role of Schopenhauer is greatly undersold Roger depends on Kant and Hegel. This is, after all, his academic expertise, and I think very much his personal philosophy is explained in that way. But what happens here is that Schopenhauer's role in this becomes very, very much diminished. And we actually know that Wagner read Schopenhauer as he was writing the music. And this idea of renouncing the will becomes extraordinarily important, not just in The Ring, but also in Tristan and Isolde. The idea that we have desires, that we have ego, that we have projects in our lives that make it very difficult for us to deal with the world, and that this can only be overcome if you do what Schopenhauer did and live as a hermit, renouncing your will. He wrote a 1,000-page book about this called The World is Will and Representation. And this is extremely influential, not only in Wagner, but within general European thought. And indeed, what we do see in the Ring cycle is that it is a renunciation that results in something that we can pretend at least is the salvation of the world. Wotan has to renounce his plans for world domination, whether they're direct, as we see them in Rheingold, or whether through easy proxies like Siegmund and Sieglinde, or even whether they're through Siegfried. And this leads us again, I think, to a point where Roger talks about this as a problem in this chapter, Siegfried and Other Problems. He talks about how there seems to be a logical inconsistency. If Wotan has renounced rule of the world, why does he stand in Siegfried's way? In that scene in the third act where Siegfried has to break his spear with the reforged sword. And I think there's a very easy answer to that. Wotan knows that in order for that renunciation to be completed, his power has to be destroyed. And Roger says, well, willing himself to destruction is just another use of his will. But no, I think it's quite different. If you believe, as he talks about in the law chapter, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, if his legitimacy, if the laws of the physical world depend on what's written on the spear, carved into the shaft of the spear, or these treaties, then that object, which has great symbolic significance, has to be destroyed. The music supports that interpretation because at the moment when the spear is shattered, you hear that descending pentatonic scale, that bom, ba bom, ba bom, 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 bom. Only in that case, it's broken in the middle, and the final bits of it, the final notes of that chord, the scale, sorry, are heard in a minor key. Why? Because Wotan's authority has been destroyed. And then he says, go on, I can't stop you anymore. Now, whether he wanted to stop him to begin with, this is something we could argue about. But the point is, he knows that his spear has to be destroyed. He knows his power has to be brought to an end. And that if he acts in any other way, if he just says, okay, I created a free hero, then he really hasn't fulfilled that full renunciation. And I think that is something Roger rather misses. In that other problems section where he talks about the other big fallacy, we have another one, which is the actual ring itself. If it's so great, if it's a weapon of mass destruction of Wagner's universe, why doesn't it protect the people who have it? We have all these different people who have the ring at different times. We know that touching it involves a curse that brings death to them and suffering before that death. Why can't they be protected by it? Well, first of all, there's no guarantee that this is protection. And Roger's idea is that, well, we don't have this because it can only work on people who are disposed to be enslaved by power, and not everyone is. But of course, you could argue that different characters who have or want the ring very much are either are free from that. They very much are against that idea. So as you go through this, you see that the ring changes hands quite frequently. And I think what the problem is that there's no will to use it. The perfect example of this, of course, is Siegfried, one of these other problems that Roger identifies, even though Siegfried is central to the work. When Siegfried gets the ring at the end of the second act of his opera, of the third opera in the cycle, he comes out wondering what it really is. And the forest bird tells him that it will give him domination of the world. But the idea of domination of the world means very little to him. He doesn't really understand that. And his lack of awareness, in his very sheltered and limited upbringing, he has no conception of power. We just did I'll tell you how this goes. We just bought a prepaid college tuition program for my 5-year-old son. It is guaranteed that he will receive a college degree. My 5-year-old son's in kindergarten. He doesn't know what a university education is. He's completely confused by all of these matters. But this prepaid investment that we did will give him the power to acquire that education. Siegfried, in his nature existence, he's very much what the Germans call a Naturkind, right? He's just outside of this physical, this kind of physical, settled legal world. He doesn't know what the power of the ring is or what it stands for. He was brought up in deliberate ignorance of that because Mima wanted to use him as a tool to get it and then use it himself. Mima knows exactly what the ring is. And you can be damn sure that if Mima had gotten his hands on it, he even fantasizes about what he would do with it. At the very end of the first act, in the Forge sequence, we focus on Siegfried because the music's very exuberant and exciting, but you also have Mima standing there saying, this will make me the master of the world. Alberic will be my slave instead of me being his slave. And I'll be, the German is, Walter des Alls, I'll be the master of the universe. So the whole idea here is that these aren't really problems. And the way Roger conceives them, I think the problem is that Roger hasn't elaborated a way of interacting that would create a Kantian interpretation. It can't fit his larger philosophical view of the work. And that's the real problem. Now, if we can go back to the other chapters on love and power and law, I think love's the most interesting one, because that's certainly the one Roger talks about most. And remember that, again, in his very Kantian philosophy, Roger had a very particular idea of what law is and what love is and what love can do. And his own personal sense of this, he's written on romantic love and on sexual love completely outside of this Wagnerian interpretation. He believes that it's a manifestation of the sacred and that it's devastating to lose and that this creates real risk. We see this throughout the ring cycle. Indeed, in that very first scene, Alberic has to curse and renounce love in order to gain the power over the world that he wants. And this fundamentally, this is an existential choice. Do you trade your comfort, your romance, your feelings, your inner self for external power and security? Alberic does it in this moment where he feels deeply resentful and deeply alienated. And we see that in our society all the time. The sacrifices that people make of choosing what they think will lead to power or wealth or fame over love and affection are tremendous and sad, and to my thinking, very scary. I spent 15 years of my life teaching students who were faced with that choice, not only as students, but also in their larger professional lives. And the results are there to be seen as everything becomes relentlessly more competitive, relentlessly more difficult. The students confront life with this expectation that they would have it all, and the realization that their resources, not only their financial resources, but even their emotional and psychological resources, are in fact quite limited, and that they often have to make very difficult choices. We see this particularly among millennials today. I'm sorry, Fisher. I'm sorry, Diego. Who else is a millennial here? Y'all are having less sex, scientifically studied, than previous generations. So you're just not able to do this for whatever reason. And we see explanations of it in individual cases. I think I mentioned before Martha Nussbaum, the philosopher Martha Nussbaum, talked about her female law students at the University of Chicago who felt that romantic love was a kind of weakness because fundamentally it invites unacceptable risk. And if you're at that risk, if you're taking a chance that your legal education won't work out because of a romantic commitment that you've made, then fundamentally you're jeopardizing your future, your own sacrifices, your own hard work, sacrifices that may have been made on your behalf by your parents to send you through the elite education that you needed to get to the University of Chicago Law School. And in a lot of cases, you're betraying feminism itself. It's a pressure that young men in our society don't have, but for a young woman to reject professional success, which is the only sort of morally defensible success many people in our society believe in, then fundamentally they've also rejected the values of feminism and the sacrifices of previous generations. And that leads to an immense amount of psychiatric and emotional pain. The number of students who are university students who are diagnosed with some form of mental illness or personality disorder has increased by a factor of 5 just in the last 20 years. And we have that very frequently cited Yale University Law Review statistic: 70% of Yale law students self-report some kind of mental disorder. And that's very frightening. What were the other 30%? Did they have yet to be diagnosed? Did they get better or worse after they graduate? Yeah, these are very real issues for us. And I think it's here in this love section that Roger gets closest to defining what the ring means for our own society, beyond his Kantianism. And he does discuss that in great detail. Like, what does it mean to be in love? And what he thinks is it's two subjectivities, two subjective people, an I, like me, and another I, meaning somebody else, who recognize something in each other that's very important and have a mystical moment. And in addition to the alienation factor, he also lists as very, very important for our study of the ring cycle, the role of jealousy and the role of envy that come into this. Because when you give romantic love, commonly, probably usually, you expect that it will be an exclusive arrangement, and that when you find that it isn't, or the other person doesn't want it to be, this can provoke some very, very bad feelings. And we see that type of betrayal and its expression in Brunhilde. She goes from goddess who is supposed to define the eternal feminine, at least in Roger's interpretation. I think it's a bit more complicated. To be reduced from godhood to mortal woman doesn't give you eternal feminine, in my point of view. But she goes from that to vicious murderess, conspiring with the son of Alberich in about 30 minutes. She's very, very easily broken by this. When she's put to a serious test with some circumstantial evidence that doesn't actually work out, right? It's like Siegfried has no memory of taking the ring, and there's some confusion about who it belongs to. Is it his or is it Gunther's? In that second act of Götterdämmerung, she simply takes the easiest possible route and says, okay, it's Siegfried's fault. He betrayed me. Now he has to die. There's no room for explanation. There's no dialogue. There's no direct conversation between them. It's simply Brunhilde's death wish on Siegfried and this implacable rage, which leads to one of the most musically and dramatically one of the best parts of the ring cycle, that vengeance trio at the end of the second act. Surprisingly, Roger never touches on that at all. That vengeance trio is deeply important, not just dramatically, but also musically. It shows that Hagen has a musical mastery of that situation. His motif predominates over Gunther, who's a complete weakling, and also over Brunhilde's, who has these residual memories, now played in these depressing minors, of what her love for Siegfried really was. It's been betrayed, it's been diminished, and it's dominated by Hagen's conspiracy and his fundamental evil, which, again, isn't even in the service of his father. It's more about himself, right? He says, to myself, I swear that I will do this. In that weird preamble to the act, it's weird, but it's wonderful. That scene where Hagen and Alberich confront each other, right? And we don't know if Hagen's asleep or if he's just sort of passively listening, but Alberich is practically begging him to fulfill his project, which is to get the ring back. And Hagen is there saying, I swear to myself that I'll accomplish this, not to you. In Kasper Holten's wonderful production for the Royal Danish Opera, which I think may be on YouTube somewhere still, we see this in full force. That scene is created in what looks like a schoolroom where Hagen has been raised to learn about the different features of this universe of the ring cycle. And when it's over, when Hagen is told, be true to me, Alberich says, be true to me, stay as I treu. Hagen takes out something that looks like a butcher's knife and kills him. And it makes sense. It can at least work dramatically, because we do never see Alberich again after that. right? But the idea is that Hagen will be his own person out of envy and resentment, just in the way that Wotan hopes Siegfried will be his own person out of innocence and a freedom of envy and a freedom of resentment. Remember that in that scene where he confronts Erda and Siegfried at the end of at the beginning of the third act, where he's talking to Erda and says, so he's talking of Siegfried. Siegfried is innocent of love and free of envy. In other words, he's the opposite of what Alberic has raised his progeny to be. We also get from there, from this resentment, he has a digression into the nature of envy and evil. And what is really evil in this story? And again, this relates to love because the absence of love, the utter absence of it, is what drives the plot, I think, at least. And Roger talks about it in very Faustian terms. He goes back to Goethe's famous Mephistopheles, this literary figure of the devil. Who is Mephistopheles? Mephistopheles is the devil who denies existence and creation. It's not about doing mean things to people. It's about undoing what creation is. It's about demolishing what exists. And the direct quote from Mephistopheles, which comes out in all the different operatic interpretations of Faust, by the way, is I am the spirit, ich bin der Geist, der vernagt. I am the spirit that denies. Right? In Boito's Mephistopheles, it comes out in Italian, io sono lo spirito che nega. Right? And it has a wonderful bass aria that very, very talented bassists love to sing. Why? Because the devil always gets the best lines, right? So in Milton, in Faust, in Goethe's Faust, and even Albert, you could argue Alberic and Hagen have pretty good lines in the Ring Cycle. But the absence of love would be reduced to this spirit of denial, the idea that you want to do away with what exists and what is around. You have to learn how to destroy that. And I think that's very important because we do see a huge amount of resentment running in our own society now. That's something that's very, very present. Believe me, having worked in academia for 15 years, it couldn't exist without it. Right? The current structures of it would fall to pieces if everyone stopped being resentful. And the amount of resentment directed at Roger in his life and in his academic career were absolutely tremendous, considering what his colleagues in the UK tried to do to him at various stages. It was enormous. I wish he had put more insight in how to deal with it, because, again, when you talk to Roger Scruton, he was, at least in his later years, very free of that. He emphasized gratitude and forgiveness fundamentally as Christian virtues, when he had a heightened sense of religion toward the end. Do you forgive the people who have harmed you? And I think he would very much agree that he did. And also a desire not to complain much about them. Even with his problem in the very last months of his life with the New Statesman, he resented the cancel culture. He was very upset about what had happened. But at the same time, would he, on an individual level, wish death on those who had crossed him? Absolutely not. He was far too generous for that. And achieving that balance of mind is, I think, a very difficult thing for people to do. And your natural instinct is to want to get even. But transcending that and to put your energies into something else, including to forgive those people, that's something that he had very much. And maybe it was too sore of a subject to include in this book, but I think that's an important part of it. On the subject of power, how do you conflate love with power? Well, this is, of course, very important to the story because, after all, Alberic is giving up love, he's renouncing love so that he can gain power over the world. And what he wants to do is not just be loveless himself, but also to impose a loveless tyranny. Roger calls it a loveless, depersonalized tyranny over the world where nobody loves. I can't have it, so nobody else can. Now that sounds pretty nasty, but again, that's the root of resentment. It's not that you are upset because somebody has some advantage over you, whether it's wealth or power or virtue or whatever that is, but because the fact that it exists, that you're not capable of it, so you want it to be eradicated in order to feel good about yourself. This is something that happens. And it also raises the important question, are you at all capable of feeling good about yourself if you really feel that way? Do you think Alberic would be a happy master of the world? We already see the limits of his vision in that very short period of time when he actually has the ring and the power to compel people to do what he wants to do. It's limited to bossing around Nibelungs, the lowest form of life in Wagner's universe, in his subterranean empire. He's not out there taking down the gods yet. Now, there's no suggestion here that Alberic needs to use the ring in the way that like Luke Skywalker masters the Force. It's not something you do on a learning curve through applied effort. He has the literal power to rule everything in the world. But why doesn't he? The only limitation on him isn't it's not a limitation of what the ring can do. It's not a limitation of what he's capable of doing with the ring. He can do anything he wants. The limits is within his own vision. And his own vision in that moment is to boss around the people who are most like him, characters who are most like him, the other Nibelungs, and force them to do what he says they should do. Right? So as time goes on, this is what happens. And also as the cycle progresses, we never see any evolution of that. We never see Alberic's character growing or changing in any way. The obsessive, nasty, mean, disgusting Alberic we see in Das Rheingold is the same one we see sitting at the edge of Fafner's cave in Siegfried, which, by the way, is called Neidhöhle, or the Cave of Envy. Right? Makes perfect sense. Wishing in some way that he could get the ring from Fafner in exchange for helping him preserve his life from Siegfried who's coming along. And he still entertains his fantasies of destroying the gods and ruling it over him long after Wotan has renounced his own will to make the gods again the masters of the universe by acting through his own progeny, by acting through Sigmund and later through Siegfried. Wotan's legal order is rather different. It again involves a sacrifice. In Götterdämmerung, we actually learn the full backstory of how he lost his eye. He mentions in Rheingold that he gave it up for Fricka, but what we see in Götterdämmerung when the Norns have their conversation, again, the Norns represent the wisdom of the world, so you can rely on them telling the truth, right? That's why they're there. He lost it in order to gain the branch from the world ash tree that he would use as his spear and the source of his authority. So losing the eye wasn't just about getting a woman, Fricka, his wife. It was about winning wisdom and the ability to trade an existential part of him, partly his ability to see, in order to see in a different way, metaphorically, if you like, but also to get the means from nature to dominate the world through law and treaty. This becomes very problematic, and Roger, he goes into a kind of lengthy legal explanation. Remember that in addition to being a very talented philosopher and specialist in many subjects, Roger did actually take a law degree when he was working as a young academic. He was actually teaching, I think, at the time, and just in the evenings took the law course just so he'd have the law degree. And I don't believe he ever like practiced in any official way, but certainly he has all the legal concepts down. And Wotan's idea of legal order depends on contracts. And then we get into this very philosophical discussion. If your dominion depends on contract law, does it then follow that you are contractually obliged to enforce it? And there are moments where it seems like Wotan definitely does. Remember that Wotan himself possesses the ring, and when the giants come to collect their bill, to collect the goddess Freya in exchange for having built Valhalla, Wotan could, if he really wanted to, just eliminate them. There's nothing that says that if you have all the power in the world, you can't just destroy these inferior beings who are after your source of not just youth, but even survival. But he doesn't do that. Why? Because it would break the rules. And if he breaks his own rules, then what legitimacy does he have to rule the world? Of course, the idea here is that there has to be some usurpation of what this is. And Alberic points this out to him. Remember that Alberic's vile, and he admits he's vile. He renounced love to gain power over the world. As far as Wotan's concerned, he is a benevolent force he's the character I think we would all most like to be in the ring cycle. But in reality, his power depends on Alberic's ability to curse his own existence and steal the ring. Without that sacrifice, without the ability to pay off the giants through Alberic's treasure, Wotan's lost. He has no basis to rule. He's got no ability to sustain his power under that spear. It depends on what the Mestres, and Roger was a great theorist of reaction as well. Joseph de Maistre was a great reactionary French philosopher. He talks about this legitimacy or legitimate usurpation of power. In other words, Wotan's relying on somebody else's theft to justify his own rule. All of the legal strictures we have in our country and everywhere else depend on some form, in some way in which somebody's freedom has been denied them. Like we all agree to more or less to follow established laws. We pay our taxes. We don't speed. We don't litter. We understand that we have the freedom to do these things as people, but we choose not to do them either out of civic duty or because we would face significant penalties if we transgressed those rules. Nevertheless, they depend on, in some way, giving up part of your freedom. The big moral question for Wotan is, though, how much of his freedom does he have to give up to be an enforcer of his own rules? And the answer is quite a lot. He's surprisingly able to do this. I think Fricka defeats him very easily in that argument in the second act of Valkyrie, where she says that if you don't uphold my rights as the goddess of marriage and destroy the union of Siegmund and Sieglinde, your incestuous children, then the gods are doomed. We will disappear into nothingness because you're not maintaining my rights, which you have guaranteed by your spear. A good counter argument to that, if you were Wotan, would just be, so what, you old hag? If you don't like it, get lost. Go find some other god to marry. I'm going to sire all the legitimate children I need to make my own project come true. And if you don't like it, you can stuff it. And if I'm breaking my own law, it's okay. He actually does come close. When Fricka says, whoever heard of a brother and sister falling in love and running off with each other? Wotan just looks at her and says, you've heard of it now. And depending on how that line's delivered in the particular production you're seeing, it often gets a laugh, usually from the men in the audience. It's like you're dealing with something you didn't expect. I have nothing more to say about it. But nevertheless, Wotan remains very principled in his application of law. And he gets ever more abstract in his abilities to defeat his own predicament. If he helped Siegmund in a way that seems to transgress his previous agreements, if he's using Siegmund more or less as a tool to go out and do what he wants, he then needs a Siegfried who can overthrow him. A Siegfried who will literally shatter his spear, destroy his authority, and in that beautiful music, in the third act of Siegfried, you will hear that the last that descending scale of the spear leitmotif shattered and then played in a minor because you know his power is at an end. We hear it again in the third act of Götterdämmerung of our opera that we should have watched for today, when Brunhilde starts her immolation scene. Its beginning is dominated by a playing of that scale, the descending scale of Wotan's spear, because she is now asserting her authority over what's happening in the cycle. And she gets the last scene where everything is supposed to be resolved. When we talk about what's happening there, it's clear that Brunhilde is now in a position, knowing everything that she knows, which is the whole story of the cycle, more than any other character. She knows it completely. She's able to restore the ring to the Rhine maidens and peace, at least to the gods. Remember, she keeps saying about Wotan, Ruhe, Ruhe, du Gott, like she's putting him to sleep, just as he had put her to sleep. In Valkyrie, she's bringing the cycle to a conclusion on that theme of redemption. And again, we get into one of these legalistic problems in the Siegfried and Other Problems chapter. Roger also makes this point, which was raised to Wagner from the very beginning. In fact, before Wagner even composed one note of the music of the ring cycle, his friend August Röckel wrote to him and said, well, if the ring is restored to the Rhine maidens at the end of Götterdämmerung, why do they have to be destroyed? And Wagner's response to this was, don't talk to me like a lawyer. This isn't a legal argument. This isn't a court case. Finally, he says the answer is in the music. So what happens musically in that immolation scene? It's Brunhilde building on that theme of love between her and Siegfried, expressing what's about to happen, that the world as they know it will be destroyed and cleansed by elements of nature. Remember that we have a fire going. She summons Loga to light Siegfried's funeral pyre. He's burning up. She's going to ride into him, and the river Rhine overflows its banks. So the element of water comes and extinguishes the fire, but also drowns the rest of the world. And for good measure, and again, I wish Roger had shared some insight into this. As the Rhine maidens recover the ring, we also see Hagen try to get it, and so they drown him. So their act of redemption also involves an act of murder. We don't care that they're murdering Hagen. He's a miserable bastard anyway. So they're actually drowning the source of resentment that had played a significant role in corrupting the world anyway. This is Alberic's son, after all, right? This progeny of resentment. Wotan has great lines for him when we know that he's been conceived in the second act of Valkyrie. He calls him Hassesfrucht, the fruit of hatred, and then Neideskraft, like the strength of envy. So we know he's going to be a bad dude, and that he's also going to continue Alberic's evil deeds. So they not only recover what they lost to Alberic, but they also extinguish any possibility of him returning to come and get it. There are productions like in Harry Kupfer's Ring for Bayreuth in the late 80s, where a solitary figure of Alberic walks across the stage at the end of Götterdämmerung. It's one of these other questions, unless you see him killed after his confrontation with Hagen, as we do in Holton's production, what happens to Alberic anyway? His fate is unknown to us. We don't know where he goes, what becomes of him. To have him observe that action suggests that he might come back, that those resentments that are very, very human might also be something that's still very present in the new world that is reborn by this. And of course, the immolation scene ends on the leitmotif of Sieglinde's love. Her blessing to Brunhilde and Valkyrie is repeated at that moment. What's fascinating, I think, about that leitmotif, you hear the blessing in Valkyrie, but then you never hear it again until the very last moment of the opera. It's a very important leitmotif, but it's one of the least used. It's only used twice. We only hear it happen twice. And I think that sparing use of it makes it more important. It really stands out in Valkyrie in the third act, and then it really, of course, unites the symphonic ending of the whole cycle in Brunhilde's immolation scene, as it's the last thing that we hear played before the end of the opera and the restoration of the world. So I think that's a lot that we could do today. We can also mention Wagner's idea that, and this is something that Roger very much seizes on, that in order to find your self-realization and your redemption, you have to accept your own mortality. Again, Wotan accepts his mortality and wishes for his own end. Once he realizes that he's in this legal, moral, ethical predicament, right? And that this is very much consistent with what Kant argued, is that to realize your Selbstbestimmung, your Feuchtigen, self-consciousness, you have to accept that your own end will come. And that doing this, embracing mortality, can really only be understood by the concept of losing immortality. That delaying your own death, that trying to preserve your life indefinitely is folly, and that this can lead you into terrible directions. That being afraid of your extinction from the world is really what drives you. It's again a very Schopenhauerian idea. This idea that you have to renounce not just immortality, but the importance of goals in your life in order to find contentment is extremely important. Try and remember also that Schopenhauer was reading in Eastern religions deeply. So if this sounds somewhat Buddhist to you, there are very strong ideas of that floating. It's not a perfect representation of Buddhism or of Eastern religions, but it's sort of like refracted through this prism of Schopenhauer, and it radiates on Wagner in a way that I think is rather more meaningful than what Roger thought in the book. So I think that's all I have to say today. We could move to questions and discussion if you like.